At this place in history, we're in Barrie at the Vermont History Center and with the Executive Director of the Vermont Historical Society, Steve Perkins, and we're talking about a very famous woman today.
We are. So we're going to talk about Clarina Howard Nichols. Very important to Vermont, also very important to our country in general. But she was an abolitionist, and she was involved in the temperance movement, and she was a great proponent of early women's rights. So we're going to go upstairs and learn more about her.
Can't wait.
So Amanda, we found some nice seats here in the library at the Vermont History Center of the Vermont Historical Society, and we're going to talk a little bit about Clarina Howard Nichols, who, is my understanding, was a real force of nature. And so we've asked Lynn Blackwell, former board member of the Vermont Historical Society and great scholar, to talk to us a bit about this woman.
Well, Nichols was one of the pioneers of the early women's rights movement in the 1840s. And she was a colleague of Susan B. Anthony. But she was born in a very small village, West Townsend, Vermont, to a family that had come up here after the Revolutionary War. But later she began writing for the Windham County Democrat, a paper in Brattleboro. Eventually she married the editor, George Nichols. And then she turned that paper into what we think of as an early reform journal. She advocated for women's rights, for temperance, and anti-slavery. And her columns were very well received, actually. She had lots of battles with the various other newspaper editors around the state over issues, particularly one man from Middlebury who challenged her women's rights agenda. But her columns did influence the legislature, and in 1847 they passed a modest reform of married women's property rights. 2 or 3 years later, she was the first woman to speak in front of the legislature. And she had, at that point in time, submitted a petition to the legislators requesting that they allow women to vote in school meetings. Of course, women couldn't vote at the time, but she argued that if women were supposed to control and monitor children and oversee their education, therefore they ought to be able to vote at the school meeting. Well, this was an innovation for the legislators to see a woman in front of them, because it was not common for women to speak to a male audience. So she was very, very nervous. And they listened very attentively, they clapped, but afterwards they quickly dismissed her petition because most of men at that point in time believed that women shouldn't get involved in what they called the nasty business of politics. And in 1854, she went out to Kansas. And she took 2 of her sons who were interested in buying land out there, and they settled on the frontier. Now, this was really a change for a woman who had grown up in the commercial center and was used to the commercial center of Brattleboro, which was very bustling, to settle in a log cabin on the frontier. But she continued, and she became very prominent out in Kansas as a women's rights leader. She spoke, she wrote, and she wrote extensively in Kansas newspapers. And in fact, after the Kansas situation became resolved, she was able to sit at the first Constitutional Convention, and she wrote clauses that were inserted in the Constitution that guaranteed women legal property rights and custody rights and equality in school affairs.
And this was the state constitution.
This was
Kansas,
the state
yeah.
constitution, still exists today, and her clause allowed women to be equally involved in schools and to vote in school meetings. So in Kansas, she was successful at getting the major reform that she cared a lot about.
At this place in history.